So the key discussion points of the current online session are as follows. The first question, the scale or the scope of personality and stages of personality evolution and development. And the second question, interdependence of the personality development level and the mentality of the person. And now please let me introduce our speakers right in the way they're given the floor. I'm pleased to greet Professor Dr. Liah Greenfeld from USA, Professor of Sociology, Political Science and Anthropology at Boston University. She has a PhD in Sociology of Art from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and has taught sociology in several American universities, including Harvard, Chicago, and MIT. She is best known for her trilogy on nationalism, Nationalism, 5 Roads to Modernity, The Spirit of Capitalism, Nationalism and Economic Growth, and Mind, Modernity, Madness, the Impact of Culture on Human Experience. We are glad to have you together with us. Our next speaker is Professor Rik Pinxten, Belgium, researcher in cultural anthropology at Ghent University. He was chairman of the Liberal Humanist Association of Flanders, the Flemish section of the Humanist Association, Belgium. He is also the chairman of the Center for Intercultural Communication and Interaction of the University of Ghent. Together with Gérard Moutier, he was an advocate for the creation of the Progressive Music Forum, the Crook, in Ghent. In 2004, he received the ARC Prize of the Free Word for his book, The Artistic Society. We are pleased to greet you, dear professor. Our next speaker is Dr. Adam Glaz, Poland, who teaches and researches in cognitive and cultural linguistics at Maria Curie Skłodowska University in Lublin, Poland. His special interests lie in linguistic worldview and in viewpoint phenomena in language. He has edited and co-edited several volumes, including The Linguistic Worldview, Ethnolinguistics, Cognition and Culture, and Languages, Cultures, Worldviews. Focus on translation. His recent authored monograph is Linguistic Worldviews, Approaches and Applications. We're grateful to have you together with us. The next speaker would be Dr. Lucien Oulahbib, France, writer, lecturer, sociologist, political scientist, academician of European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. He is a chief editor of scientific journal Dogma. Dr. Lucien spent many years working together with French thinker Jean Baudrillard, author of numerous scientific papers and books on French nihilism and neo-Leninism, radical Islamism, anti-Americanism, and anti-Semitism. Sheer greetings, Dr. Lucien Oulahbib. And the next speaker is Darina Karuna, Ukraine, member of the Special Scientific Unit Expeditionary Corps, research fellow of the Memory Institute, editor-in-chief of the Scientific Expedition Journal. She is an honorary member of the Psychological and Philosophical Society, presidium member of Odessa Historic Literature Scientific Society, as well as the member of the oldest Odessa Photographic Society. It's great to have you together with us. And right away, let me please deliver just a few words regarding the reference terms of this panel. So each and every of you shares the opportunity to answer 2 questions in 2 rounds, and please limit the extent of your speeches up to 8 or 10 minutes, no longer than 10 minutes, please. To begin with, we shall start the discussion on the very first issue. The scale or scope of personality and stages of personality evolution and development. And to begin with, I would like to give the floor to Professor Dr. Liah Greenfeld. You're welcome. Please turn on your mic. Yes.
Thank you. It is impossible to conduct an international discussion on a question of any importance without first agreeing on the meaning of the terms used. In mathematics and natural sciences, such agreement necessarily precedes any conversation. Cross-border intellectual exchanges in traditional areas of humanities scholarship, relying on the shared knowledge of pertinent languages, as in classics or medieval history, similarly presuppose agreed upon nomenclature. But such is certainly not the case of the present discussion, the terms of which are so ill-defined in any language that the position of the speakers, as thought in their respective idioms, are mutually untranslatable. The questions posed in English for this panel are translated from Russian. But how can we be sure that personality has the same referent as lичность when neither personality nor lичность are clearly defined? Let's take a clue from the focus on the scale and scope or масштаб in the first question. Note that the significance here is self-evident. In fact, the organizers felt that the speakers required a personal explanation with specific examples. From Kanike's explanation, I understood that the organizers wanted us to address the relative historical impact of or mark left by a person, an individual, which indeed can be translated into Russian as личность, in distinction to personality, which rather refers specifically to the temperament of a person. What allows one to talk of the impact or mark left by a person or личность, or in other words, what this presupposes, is that a person, an individual, is understood as an agent. The question concerns the historical impact of or mark left by a person's, individual's action, whether mostly mental, such as the thought of Darwin or Einstein, or the creativity of Shakespeare and Mozart, or mostly outward, numbers of people killed because of Hitler, Stalin, or Mao, for instance. Only a very small percentage, perhaps 1% of humanity ever have an historical impact or leave any noticeable mark. So indeed, it is an interesting question why they do. English has a specific term for the seat of human agency, and thus personhood and individuality, the mind. Most other languages, including Russian and French, for instance, lack the exact equivalent of it, and in academic discussions, is forced to substitute for it such esoteric terms as mentalitet or mentality, which derives from the same Latin root. Though obscured by the lack of the term for the seat of agency, there is a general awareness among participants in related discussions that all action originates as mental. And since the Romantic period, there is also a specific term in all European languages, at least, for the exceptional person, individual, личность, the agent who leaves a mark. We call it genius. This conceptual analysis and hopefully clarification allows us to translate and reformulate the first question for this panel. The question we actually want to discuss and understand is, does the mind of a genius develop differently from regular minds? Specifically, does the mind of a genius follow different stages, study of development? Is it more or better developed than regular minds? When we recognize that the greatest mark has been left by murderous political leaders of the Kraftgenie variety, as Goethe named them, who in addition represent at least half of large-scale, крупномасштабные, so to speak, personalities envisioned by the organizers of our panel, the answer to the last question is clearly no. Answering the general formulation of question 1 depends on the understanding of the mind and the definition of genius. Giving this question a reliable, objective, that is a scientific answer, depends on the recognition of the actual nature of the mind and genius as empirical phenomena. How does one access this actual nature? In the same manner in which physics and biology access their respective subjects, that is via the scientific method of conjectures and refutations, the logical formulation of hypotheses and search for contradictions to them in the relevant evidence. Both logical formulations and search for empirical contradictions to conjectures necessitate comparisons. Comparison is the essential practice in every scientific pursuit. Among other things, this points to the unreliability, in the best case, insufficiency, which is the flaw of induction, in the worst, outright fallacy of all attempts to understand anything in isolation. It so happens that this is the common problem of all social sciences, indeed explaining the absence of progress in them. And this is nowhere more damaging than in psychology. Psychology focuses on the human individual as a self-contained phenomenon. And self-contained phenomena, that is, phenomena intrinsically unconnected to their environments, do not exist. Presuming that the explanation of the individual lies within the individual makes psychology, which presents itself as the science of the mind, a futile pursuit. This makes questionable all psychological theories, including those in developmental psychology that postulate various stages in mental development. As an empirical phenomenon, the mind, like any other empirical phenomenon, therefore, cannot be productively accessed outside of its environment. Analyzing human environment, however, allows one to deduce from it logically, that is, hypothesize the nature of the mind, which then can be tested against empirical evidence. For example, we can conjecture what a healthy mind would need to consist of to allow for the survival of the individual within that environment and the continuation of the environment itself, and then test this conjecture against the clinical evidence of mental disease. This is what I did in Mind, Modernity, Madness. Given that humans are also animals, the essence of human environment can only be understood in comparison with non-human animal environments, which unavoidably leads to one to recognize the centrality of the symbolic dimension in it. Given that much of the human environment is symbolic, in turn, means that the organ of the brain in humans needs to process symbols, something that animals in the wild do not have to do. Because of the symbolic dimension of the environment, this processing, this mental process, acquires a symbolic dimension as well. And while happening by the means of the brain, cannot be reduced to the regularities of organic processing. The human mental process, the mind, is a symbolic process. It is, in effect, culture in the brain. The organic faculties or capacities of the animal brain, such as learning, memory, imagination, are transformed and become, in addition to being organic, symbolic learning, memory, and imagination. This transformation, the development, or rather acquisition of human mind, happens very early in life, simultaneously with the acquisition of language, the main symbolic process on the collective level. And it happens at once, not in stages. One can no more have a bit of a mind than be a little pregnant. The symbolic phenomenon of the mind, however, exists by means of the organic phenomenon of the brain. and the organic, including genetic qualities of each individual brain, add to the individuality of the mind, just as the organic qualities of each individual stomach add, together with the food the stomach must process, to the individual experience of digestion. The individual mental process, in other words, has both symbolic and organic components, depending on both and reflecting both in its expressions. The mind of a genius is the mind characterized by a particularly strong, organically produced imagination. That is a particularly swift processing of a specific symbolic material, which may be musical or military, literary or political, and so on. A capacity of the brain activated by a particular symbolic environment. The mark a genius leaves can never be attributed to the individual alone. It is always a product of the symbolic environment, culture, as much as of the individual organic constitution. This is what I have to say regarding this question.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you for sharing your viewpoints. And right away, let me please give the floor to our next speaker, Rik Pinxten. You're welcome, dear Professor. Please turn on your mic. Your mic is still off.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, everything's fine.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. First of all, I think that our colleague, Professor Greenfeld, already touched on a lot of issues. Now, I'm a philosopher by training and an anthropologist by vocation, you might say. And I would like to maybe add a couple of ideas that come from that background, meaning that as a philosopher, of course, you are trained, a Western philosopher, a European philosopher, if you like, you're trained very, very much in a sort of, you might say, tunnel vision on what really matters in terms of thinking, in terms of eventually geniality or a genius, or not in terms of innovation, whatever, okay? Thinking in general. As an anthropologist, you are continuously shocked, and I think that's a very, very important experience, that this is not shared by everybody in the world. And I'd like to say a little bit about this on your specific issue here. I worked with North American Indians from the Apachean family, that is the Navajo first and foremost. And apart from that, of course, with the very, very different, how shall I say, origins of immigrants lately, the last 3-4 centuries, last 3, let's say 30-40 years coming to Europe, and including, of course, to Belgium. Now, why am I telling this? Well, because when you try to do more or less thorough field work, which is a very, very qualitative way of, if you like, doing science or trying to do research, you are puzzled not only about what people think, what people stress, what people think is important, how they want to eventually share things with you or withhold things from you, how this evolves during time. I mean, there has to be trust built up first for years in order to allow you to come to know certain aspects of what Professor Greenfeld called the culture, the insights of a particular group. It's not as if people are sitting there waiting for you to come around and share ideas with you. Now, why is this not the case? And I think this is speaking about the mentality question in general, because of course, what we call culture, and within it, what we call knowledge and mentality, if you like, ethical issues as well, is in a certain way dependent on a set of intricacies, I would say, which are bound up with what we call education. There used to be a time when anthropologists in particular spoke about different cultures in the world, meaning, in fact, different groups, communities, with their specific, their particular habits, their particular beliefs, their particular ideas on social organization, etc. And gradually over the last, well, maybe half century, there's a criticism working within anthropology, which is sound, I think, which is a decent way of reshuffling, really deep reshuffling, saying that we now know that ever since the Neanderthals and the starting of the Homo sapiens, mixing, intercultural communication, intercultural mixing has been the rule rather than the exception. So how on earth could we think that there is something like culture one being one community, culture two being another community, etc., with their identities, etc.? Now we still do that, as you know, most certainly in the West. There's a new identity politics growing all over the place, which is absolutely horrendous, absolutely unscientific, but very popular. Now, if you see this as an anthropologist and you go elsewhere and people somehow do a very different tradition, and people somehow mistrust you or question this sort of attitude and say, you know, we're all human beings, but with different touches, different ways of coping with survival, then it takes a long time. I don't know how to express this in a different way. It takes a long time of deep reorientation within yourself, not only as a scientist, so within theories, if you like, but as a human being, to accept this. Okay, that's my first point. So mentality is not some sort of category out of a universal classification system or something. It's linked to who you are as a person, also as a researcher person, human being, and interacting with other traditions, people from other horizons in the world. I think if we are open enough, if we are more honest now than, for example, well, a couple of decades ago, and certainly a couple of centuries ago, we have to open up in a very wide, in a very deep sense, in order to understand that indeed there is only human beings. There are all sorts of, that's my solution then, learning types and learning traditions and contents of learning, learning products, if you like, around in the world, made by human beings all over the place in different contexts, of course. And this is what we then try to classify, try to identify, try to put into molds somehow and call it culture one, culture B, etc. But beware of that. This is most probably not correct. This is most probably a lot of presuppositions that we can hardly get rid of. Now, why is this? Why is this so complex, and what has mentality to do with all of this? I'll try to give at least one hint of what I think I understand after this career with, well, primarily these North American Indians. When I came to the Navajo Reservation, which is a large area, desert area mainly, not very much or not very densely populated. I mean, it's 4 times Belgium, and there's only 300,000 people out there, so that's very little, but with groups, they're not living in villages either. They're spread all over the territory in family groups, if you like, clan groups, etc. A lot of them still speaking the original language, which is very, very different, of course, from the so-called European or Euro-Asian languages that most of us come from. Now, one of the things that I experienced was that authority, of course, in our understanding, and I think that's part of the mentality and certainly part of the genius idea that we use most of the time. Authority, as we understand it, is not really recognized. And on the other hand, it looked as if, yes, there was something like that was recognized. How does this work out? I'm going to a specific or particular example. At some point, I worked with a very, very old man. He was really exceptional. He was 104 in a very strong family. Life expectancy is like, still now today is like 60, 62. So it's a very, very exceptional family, he's a very exceptional man. And he was considered to be a speaker, thinker, if you like, storyteller, but with a philosophical content most of the time. People came to him from really 100 miles away. They came up to him to listen to him. He had a very poetic language. His name in English is Curly Mustache because he had a very Ho Chi Minh sort of mustache, very rare for an Indian, but well, for a North American Indian or a Native American, as we say today. But people come up to him not because he knew, like in a revelation or something, about what reality was really like, but because he had an interesting view on things. And that's not derogatory. I mean, people told me that he said so himself. You know, if you're interested in this sort of stories, in fact, philosophical interpretations on what the world is coming to, his world, but his world in deep contact, of course, in rather harsh contact from time to time with the Western American world, what we call modernity. I have to discuss that, whether we're on the right track there, but okay. He said, you know, if you're interested in this, well, maybe you could go over to this other woman or other man, you know, 100 kilometers away, because he's or she is busy with this too. And listen to him, and this is very different from what I say, but you know, like I would say now, as a Westerner, of course, we're all seeking, we're all searching. We don't know to begin with. In a scientific attitude, you would say we're all fallible, and we can only, you know, try and approach things, and then maybe 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, for the lucky ones in your life, you think you've got an idea, and you know this is somehow innovating, this sort of thing. The attitude that I found with this curly mustache, for example, and from his surroundings, I mean, from the people who came up, really, it's an adventure, right? In that sort of area, and go 100 kilometers and drive up to the man in order to listen to him, telling a story, philosophical story about how he felt reality took shape now in his life, during his life. Quite a personality, like a guru, we would say, somebody who knew. No, somebody who had an idea, he had a perspective. And that's how he presented himself. I have a perspective. And yes, of course, we can recognize this But I can tell you, and we can all tell each other, I think that if you would try and live this way, try to present ourselves this way in academia, we would be out of a job in a minute, okay? It doesn't work that way. We pretend and we keep pretending as if we are the master of the thing we are studying. We're not in there, we're not part of it. And genius is the one who is more the master, the sort of unique master. At least that's my understanding, but maybe I'm transformed over time by the anthropological experience, could be. But that's my understanding how we sort of deal with, the genius is the one who has the pure mentality, the right mentality, and hence has the unique insight, this sort of thing. Maybe most geniuses, or some geniuses, at least I read, would not agree on that, about themselves. But in our culture, apparently, in our tradition, we sort of look for this sort of savior, the one who knows. And that's a very funny thing. And even scientists, at least in my experience, keep doing this. Because there is this real truth or something that we can find. I'm not saying anything about whether there is or isn't any real truth. I'm only saying with the complexity, by working with other people, complexity that you find in human beings all over the world, not only here, of course, in our culture, let's say, but all over the world, with this complexity and the way people treat this issue of the one outstanding, superior, whatever type of insights and knowledge, etc., very, very differently from us, with much more caution, I would say, than we do. In a sense, less or differently methodologically, of course, or methodically, but at least several, not only with these North American Indians, but several that I encountered were extremely cautious about, I'm having this sort of perspective on things, on how reality is presenting itself and how I am embedded, of course, involved deeply within this reality. Again, an attitude that is different from the one that we have in the West, because we sort of objectify. We're the outsider looking at it in a sort of almost godlike position, as if we can objectively observe and describe, etc.
Thank you so much, dear Professor Pinxten. Could we conclude with that, your speech?
Yes. Deeply in terms of mentality, I think there's a difference here. This sort of being within this reality and very cautiously trying to develop perspectives, maybe compare perspectives, versus the mentality that we tend to have, that we are raised in, as you can have a sort of objective, superior position and study from there, understand from there. I think in terms of mentality, that's a very, very crucial issue. And we're not yet fully conscious of this, I think. Okay, that's my first message here.
Thank you so much, dear Professor. Thank you for delivering your speech. And right away, I'm glad to give the floor to our next speaker, Adam Glaz. You're welcome, sir. Please turn on your mic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It'll be hard for me to say something really of substance right now after Rik's talk. I try to give my perspective. I try not to pretend that I know things, and my perspective will be that of a linguist. I'm a linguist, so I will rephrase this first question a little bit. Already the problem from the linguistic perspective. How can we do that? Well, we're looking here at personality, mentality, language, and evolution. Evolution can be understood as the development of language in a single person in the process of language acquisition, or as the evolution of language in the human race. I will say a few words about the individual in the next round. Now let me focus maybe not so much on the evolution of language in humans, but the development of the connection between the sounds that people utter, how these sounds function, and what that means for people's mentality. So we look at how that development affects who we are, not as solitary beings, but creatures that live in groups and communities. What I'm going to say goes back 100 years to the Polish-British anthropologist of early 20th century, Bronisław Malinowski. Now, Malinowski was an anthropologist, and his focus was broader than language, but he did pay a lot of attention to the role of language in the life of a community. He studied human cultures in their totality, and language is a vital part of that totality. So what I'm going to say is not exactly Malinowski's approach, but it's very much inspired by his insights, and I'd like to give him credit. So the question we ask here is how sounds that we produce are correlated with the development of our communities and cultures. One way of looking at it is that you can identify 4 major stages to the process. At the very basic stage, a sound is a reaction to a situation. Take pain. You cut your finger with a knife and say, ouch. This is an instinctive, uncontrolled reaction. Or we scream when we are terrified, or a baby will cry when he or she is hungry. These are not even words or linguistic sounds at this early stage. Rather, we notice that there is a direct, immediate, instinctive link between a given situation and our verbal reaction to it. Then, as these situations become reiterated, what we utter turn into something more than just reactions. Utterances become names for things. That is, imagine I say, ouch, every time I cut my finger with a knife or some sharp tool, which may happen rather often in a society that isn't very advanced technologically. With time, this ouch may be used to actually refer to my knife. It will become its name. At this stage, it is not a full-fledged symbol yet because it only refers to one specific object, my knife. But then it may become a symbol as it becomes used in reference to any knife. And that is a key stage when language acquires the full capacity to function as a tool and instrument of cooperation in joint action. So imagine we're working together on a boat, we're carving it from a log, and I need a knife, not a specific knife, but anything to cut wood with. I can ask you to give me ouch, and you will understand that I'm not asking for my knife, but any object of that kind, as long as it will do the job. So at this stage, ouch is a symbol for any object that falls within that class. I would say that this is a crucial stage for the mentality of that community because it is a major step from words used to refer to single objects and words used to refer to classes or categories of objects. The community has now developed the ability to generalize, to capture similarity with language, to think abstractly about many objects as being essentially the same. So all knives will belong to this category, even if each specific knife is a little different. We see that in children. A child can imitate a dog barking, woof, woof, and then that utterance, woof, woof, will function as the word, a name for any dog. However, at this stage, words are still associated with objects. And then comes the fourth, even more abstract stage, when words are no longer associated with objects, but with ideas. That is, with ouch, I may refer not to knives as objects, but to the idea of the knife, the very concept, even if there are no knives around. And not only that, but also abstract entities that are not physical objects, like friendship, mathematics, democracy, politics. Entities that we know don't exist, or ones that may or may not exist, like unicorns or space aliens. We can tell stories, build narratives, practice philosophy, reflect on our own lives, inquire into our inner selves, or indeed hold online conferences on mentality. So that's how I would say we can trace the development of mentality of a community to the point where it has become capable of building these symbolic worlds through language that need not be real in the literal sense, but that are real to us. I believe a good example is the biblical story of creation. You don't need to believe that God actually created the world in 7 days, but you can still take that story as fundamentally true about God, the world, humans, as telling you the true nature of the act of creation. This is possible thanks to the development of language that accompanied, but also aided and facilitated our own development or evolution as human beings. We have managed in this way to develop literature, poetry, philosophical reflection, science, as well as to devise systems such as mathematical or musical notation. They are all based on that fundamental ability to capture classes or categories with symbols. As our mentality has progressed from the stage of very direct connection with physical objects to one where it can access and actually construct, through the use of symbols, abstract categories. And the most complex and versatile symbolic activity is the use of language. Thank you. That will be my take on the first question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Glaz, for sharing your perspectives and your viewpoints. And right away, I'm glad to give the floor to our next speaker, France, Professor Lucien Oulahbib. You're welcome. Please turn on your mic. And let me kindly remind you, you've got 8 minutes, 8, no more than 10.
Yes, okay. Thanks to having me. And how begin? Maybe I have a text, but when I heard your guest, I thinking about two things. One, it's about the term of mentality, and for me, it means the spirit of the time. Spirit of the time, maybe the influence in the spot, historic spot. It's maybe in German. It means side guest, I suppose. Oh, l'esprit du temps in French. L'esprit du temps. The influence about the public and private mentality also, and I guess it's my second point. I guess now is the present time. I suppose we change the point spots now. We are changing in actually this kind of point spot because if you look before our epoch, our time, you had strong institutions, of course, like church, political party, and strong cultural opposition, and I suppose that now it's more complex because each individual person has the capacity to organize his own point of view and to choose the better, maybe. But it's not too simple because you have also in each society some influences, some leadership, some waves, some people try to what is the term? Try not to organize the attention of the people around some deep problems. And it's very curious to see, for instance, now each person in the society has their own problem, own focus, try to respond at some situation, some solution. But in the deep corpse, in the deep, what is the term? A spirit of the society, the collective society, if you want. You have some tremendous problem, not visible now, but this kind of problem through the society and organize like a scene where we can see some camps, some focus between many opposition. For instance, during the period between the First World War and the Second World War, you have the between period. Each person, each camp, each trend, each enterprise, etc., have their own occupation. And but as we know, as you know, between the one and second war, lot of problem began or continued. Sorry, and suddenly you have a very deep situation. You have event, a grave event, eruption, explosion, and it's very interesting because you can stay in your own position, in your own preoccupation, and but in the end, you are you have some obligation to intervene or not, to escape, maybe to escape in other country, to refuse to see the reality. For me, it's interesting to understand how it's possible, this kind of situation suddenly some event become a big preoccupation, and how it's possible to change the point spot and to reinforce the capacity to protect each person to this kind of situation, because it will be very, very serious, and maybe it's a question of death or life sometimes in the historic moment, as I suppose we have now in Europa, in USA, the history is not finished, it's not dead, I suppose, and it's why now for us, for me, it's necessary, as I said, maybe it's a link between the second question, is how we can reinforce the position of the person, and not to go anywhere in especially in two opposite position, like too open, to be too open, and to lose our capacity to analyze, to reflect, to live, and on the other hand, close our mind, to refuse any changement, any situation which afraid ourselves. It's a question for me.
Sure. Thank you so much, dear Professor. I assume it would be great to continue the thinking about these perspectives in the merits of the second question. So by this, thank you. And let me please give the floor to our next speaker, Darina Karuna. You're welcome.
Всем здравствуйте. Благодарю за приглашение на конференцию. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. Начну с того, что представлюсь. Я главный редактор научного журнала «Экспедиция», действительно член экспедиционного корпуса, научный сотрудник НИИ памяти. So I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Darina Karuna. I am the chief editor of Expeditionary Journal and active member of Expeditionary Corps. И научный сотрудник НИИ памяти. And I'm also a scholar and a scientific, research fellow at the Institute of Memory. Те данные, которые я буду говорить, они основаны на более 30-летней работе, это результаты работы академика Мальцева. And things that I will be sharing with you today on this panel are based on the data which was derived in the course of 30 years of scientific work of Dr. Oleg Maltsev. Это полевые исследования в разных точках мира. Это Африка, Канарские острова, Азия, Европа, Кейптаун, Германия, Италия и так далее, и так далее, и так далее. And so when I say the data of Dr. Maltsev's research results, mainly I will be referring to field research that he conducted over the entire globe, in Africa, in Northern America, in Southern America, and all over the Europe, specifically Austria, Germany, Portugal, Italy, and other countries. И вообще тема, которую мы обсуждаем на данной конференции, она настолько важна, что большинство людей даже не осознают ее важность. And the topic that we are discussing at this conference is very crucial. And I would say that most of the people do not even are not aware of how important is this topic.
Потому что менталитет — это не абстрактная категория, это категория особого порядка.
Because when we speak about the mentality itself, it is not an abstract category. It is a category of a special kind, special order.
Потому что именно менталитет как феномен 21 века, он выступает тем самым главным препятствием на пути человека вот при разрешении любых его жизненных задач.
Because it is the mentality as the phenomenon itself in 21st century becomes a main obstacle in humans' life on the way to shape his own future and solve this or those tasks.
То есть этот элемент, он не только сдерживает человека, он невидимо его видоизменяет, перестраивает его взгляды, его стремления, и человек, и меняет это невидимо, то есть человек даже не осознает этого.
And I would like to add that this element as mentality not only hinders a human being, but it also changes a person in a way he is not aware of.
То есть, говоря о масштабе личности и стадии эволюции личности, ну, здесь нужно мысленно поделить всю историю человечества на периоды.
Speaking about the scale of personality and the stages of personality development, I would like to start with the following, that we will have to theoretically, in our mind, divide the humanity into several historical periods.
Раньше был сословный принцип формирования менталитета. У рыцарей он формировался одним способом, у духовенства другим, у ремесленника третьим и так далее, и так далее.
Because many centuries, many years ago, the way the mentality was formed, it was according to the class of a person. For instance, in the chivalryhood, the mentality would be formed in a specific manner. When it comes to the clergy, it would be formed in a different manner. Peasants, different manner, and artisans' mentality would be formed in a completely different manner.
И при сословной организации вы выше своей головы просто не сможете прыгнуть.
And when the organization of the society is according to the classes, that class would mean that you cannot jump higher than what you're allowed to, or what is your limit of.
Ну, то есть было время до Ренессанса, когда мужчины вообще могли стать только либо священником, либо военным.
For instance, if you remember, like in the period of Renaissance, there was a certain moment in history when a man, the only options that he had is to become a clergyman or become a military person.
То есть еще раз, при сословном формировании менталитета ты не можешь подняться выше, и это стало идеологемой.
So again, just to wrap this up, that when the mentality is formed according to your class, people were bonded by certain limit, and that led to the creation of a certain ideology.
И нас будут интересовать два последних периода, когда менталитетная составляющая формировалась на базе территориального признака и на базе субкультурного признака.
And in the frameworks of this panel discussion, I would be speaking more about two last periods. Is when first one, when the mentality component was formed based on the territorial feature or territorial characteristic. And another thing that I will be talking about, when the mentality is being formed based on the subculture feature.
То есть территориальный признак – это, в общем-то, формирование менталитета на базе места рождения человека и на территории, на которой он проживает.
So to elaborate what I mean by territorial feature of formation of the mentality, I mean the simple thing that the place of birth of a person is the key factor in shaping his mentality.
И территориальный признак формирования менталитета, он возник с 1830 года, то есть после буржуазной революции.
The territorial feature of forming the mentality emerged, roughly speaking, after 1830, after bourgeois revolution.
То есть, когда мы говорим про территориальный признак, ну, естественно, большинство людей живет там, где они живут, в общем-то, где они родились, постоянно живут. Да, многие перемещаются часто, а может быть не часто, но перемещение с места на место, с территории на территорию никак не меняет менталитета личности.
So when we speak about the territorial feature of forming one's mentality, one may wonder, but what about the relocations that people did? I mean, they were living in one place and then they relocated to another at that point of time in the history. Then I should add that this relocations or moving for a certain period to live to another place, that doesn't play as large role as the place of birth.
То есть не так важно, что человек родился, да, в принципе, важно, в каком месте он появляется, потому что это напрямую влияет на ту мифологему, которую он использует и на которую он опирается, собственно, которая является неотъемлемой частью его сознания и мировоззрения.
So roughly speaking, it doesn't really matter the fact that a human being is born. What really matters is where was he born? Because depending on that, he receives a certain mythology, basically a very core myth, which influences in turn his aspirations, his structure of consciousness, and his worldview.
То есть при территориальной форме формирования менталитета у нас есть возможность его расширять.
And when our mentality is formed based on the territory where we live in, it is possible to broaden our mentality.
То есть территориальный признак формирования менталитетной составляющей человека является доминирующей и ключевой. И это, в общем-то, научное открытие академика Мальцева.
And also to add that when we speak about the territorial feature, key feature that forms the mentality, it is a dominating and a paramount component of how our mentalities are formed. And this is one of the scientific discoveries of academician Dr. Oleg Maltsev.
Но есть базовые коренные мифологемы, которые двигаются с человеком через все принципы.
And there are also, speaking about the mythologems, there are different types of them that influence a person in different ways and different stages of his life.
У нас есть сельские жители и городские жители. И отсюда мы будем получать масштаб личности.
And now, if we speak about the scale of personality, which is included in the question, then we are going to roughly divide people that are born in rural areas and people that are born in urban areas. And that in turn is a certain prerequisite which would define to a certain extent the scope, the scale of their personalities. In other words, how influential is the personality. That is what is being meant by the scale.
Люди, живущие с замкнутым пространством, то есть как в клане, да, в семейном клане, имеют клановую форму организации, в общем-то, они замкнуты в своей семье, и каждый в этой семье пытается стать символом своей семьи.
For instance, if we speak about people that were born in a rural area, then certainly these people are confined to a certain extent by their environment where they live in, by their families, and usually people with such background, they aspire to become the symbol of their families.
И это, в общем-то, влияет напрямую на устремление человека и на его социальный статус.
And that in turn naturally would influence his social status and aspirations.
При территориальной же форме человек может из села переехать в город, при определенных обстоятельствах изменения происходят, и, в общем-то, тем самым вот меняется обширность. То есть я могу стать из сельского жителя городским.
At the same time, as we can see, I mean, there are a lot of people that can relocate from rural area to urban area. And that is a certain transition in one's life, which would allow one to make adjustments to his mentality, which doesn't happen certainly consciously.
То есть есть два главных отличия. Житель села стремится стать, села, деревни, то есть какого-то маленькой территории, стремится стать символом своей семьи, а городской житель стремится стать символом города.
And now I would like to explain the main difference between these two kinds of people, if I may say so. So people that were born in the rural area, these people naturally tend to want to become a symbol of their families. In contrast to a person who lives and was born, let's say, in the urban environment, that kind of person usually aspires to become the symbol of his entire city.
И в городе у человека есть два пути. То есть либо он отказывается от менталитета, который ему навязали в семье, то есть отказываясь от вот этой клановой формы, либо он становится преступником, и причина тому банально проста.
And so when a person is living in the urban environment, he has two ways, roughly speaking, that he can choose. First one is to stop, to reject basically that mentality that was given to him in the confined area, in the family or the rural area. Or if he doesn't want to do that, sometimes people become criminals, they choose another path.
То есть в городе общественное мнение важнее, чем мнение его семьи. Если человек не хочет, ну почему важнее? Потому что среда добывания здесь, то есть это дает ему пищу, еду, одежду, в общем-то от него зависит его статус. И если человек не хочет этого делать, его не берут на работу и так далее, то есть он остается голодным, он вынужден идти воровать, как-то зарабатывать эти деньги.
And now here's an explanation of why I have mentioned the previous thing, speaking about two ways. When we speak about the urban life, then the opinion, the social opinion is way more important for a person than an opinion of a family, because in the urban environment, there is a certain, let's say, business etiquette, the way people should behave, how they should look, etc., etc. And if a person doesn't want to follow those basic norms, let's say, I mean, he just doesn't want to do that, then he's not accepted in the society. He cannot get a job that he wants. He cannot provide that quality of life that he wants. And because of those factors, he has no choice but to become a criminal.
То есть все это происходит в силу наличия его менталитета, который он получил вот в семье.
And all this thing happens because of the type of mentality that he that was formed and shaped since childhood in his family.
В городе также существуют и другие люди более высокого порядка. То есть масштаб личности этих людей требует расширения территориальности. И тогда, например, до государства, до Европы, до всего мира. То есть это уже стремление к власти, некий масштаб личности как генератор власти.
And certainly it should be pointed out that in the urban environment, there are types of people that are different. They stand a little bit higher in the hierarchy. For instance, the scale of their personality wants to expand, not only expand on the scale of the city, but go far away to the country or the entire lands, which is about power. People wanting to have more power and more influence.
Это происходит на самом деле как естественный тактический ход, потому что здесь, кто хочет стать символом города, их очень много на одном квадратном метре, и там выше зона пустая, и, в общем-то, выталкивает людей, и вот кто-то становится символом государства, символом других стран и так далее.
And the reason this happens is because it is a certain tactical way. Because when we look at the city urban environment, we have a lot of people who want to become the symbol of the city. They want to become those successful people. And so it's just enormous, crazy competition. So some people, they're just squeezed in a way to go higher. where they don't have that much of a competition, and some people do achieve more influence on a completely different level, not limited to the Senate.
Вот мы говорили о первом территориальном признаке формирования менталитета составляющей, который является доминирующей. Но нельзя обойти такой исторический факт, как религиозный кризис в мире в 1830 году, когда возник протестантизм.
Up until now, I have explained as detailed as possible in the panel about the territorial characteristic or feature that shapes our mentalities. However, I cannot pass by without mentioning the so-called religious crisis. It's a certain historical fact, and one of the pinnacles of it happened when the Protestantism appeared in the history.
То есть в этот период все начали серьезно сомневаться в состоятельности религии, до такой степени, что возникла война между католиками и протестантами.
So to put it simply, as we know from the history, at that point of time, people started thinking about inadequacy of a religion in a way that it was not sufficient for them. It didn't allow them to live the lives they want to. And that conflict escalated even to the fact that Protestants and Catholics were in fight between each other.
Ну, в общем-то, это потухло, но и сейчас не угасло, потому что церковь дальше продолжает свою дискредитацию собственного существования.
To a certain extent, that so-called religious crisis did de-escalate. However, if we look in general at the situation at the moment, we see that the church is still discrediting itself in the eyes of its people.
То есть, в общем-то, начали появляться новые религиозные движения, НРД, но это одно направление. Наряду с этим возникло и субкультурное направление, то есть субкультурный признак формирования менталитетной составляющей.
And because of that fact that was aforementioned, we see a proliferation of different new religious groups in this world and a lot of new subcultures. And subculture has become another very important feature or factor that shapes the mentality.
И главной причиной выхода на сцену вот этого субкультурного направления является абсолютная несостоятельность религии и академической науки.
And the main reason why we see on the scene this subcultures that are so popular, so influential, it is because it's an absolute insufficiency, inadequacy of modern religions and mainstream modern academic science.
То есть у человека исчезла, в принципе, наука, источники, где он может узнать, как жить. Исчезло вообще все это.
In other words, when we speak about the science of how to get things done, has disappeared in a certain extent.
I'm sorry, dear speakers. Actually, you're running out of time. By this, we should actually conclude your ideas and perspectives. Thank you so much for sharing your viewpoints. And now it's the time to switch to the second question of our online panel. Let me please announce that the interdependence of the personality development level and the mentality of the person. So this is the key discussion point for the second question. And I would like to give the floor to our dear speaker, Professor Liah Greenfeld. You're welcome. Please turn on your mic.
Well, thank you for remarkably interesting and heterogeneous presentations on the first question, which among other things point to the fact that every speaker understands those questions in a completely idiosyncratic way. There is very little agreement between the subjects on which we have spoken in regard to the first question. So again, I would say we must start with translating the question, the second question, into terms that would make certain that at least as posed in English, it means the same as when posed in Russian. Building on the conceptual analysis of the first question, including the clarification that the mind does not develop in stages, and taking into account that level or уровень in Russian is a quantitative term, I presume that question 2 addresses the issue of the possible dependence of the quality of one's mind, what is called in the question mentality of a person, or менталитетная составляющая человека, on the degree of its cultivation, thereby asking, is a cultivated, educated mind better, in the sense of being more active, more creative than an uncultivated one? Or to relate it to the first question, is a higher level of education likely to produce a genius, that is a person who would leave an historical mark? The answer to this question is no. No quantity of symbolic cultural information or stimuli from the environment can affect the mind's quality. This quality is affected only by the quality of the individual brain and the qualities, nature, configuration, contents of the culture in which it operates. The qualitative differences between the mental processes of humans and non-human animals are partly a product of the different quantity of stimuli from the environment. They have to do, first of all, with the fact that the complexity of the human environment is not simply greater than that of animals in the wild, but it is of an altogether different order of magnitude. Animals carry the immediate and most important environment, their social environment, the organization of interaction with other organisms in their species, in their genes. It is a part of their biological constitution. Therefore, while members of other animal species have to adapt only to their physical environment and the organic environment of the species, humans have to adapt above all to their immediate, most pertinent intraspecies environment, human society. Human society is genetically undetermined. We chart it symbolically and thus construct culture. We know this because of the almost infinite variability of human societies. With the addition of symbolic stimuli and experience, with the emergence of the new reality of culture and the mind, in other words, the complexity of the environment increases exponentially and proportionally increases, as we know from neuroscience, proportionally increases the mass of the brain. This jump between the natural animal and human cultured brain is so great that all additional increments in the human brain mass, owing to the relatively greater complexity of the already cultural environment, may be considered negligible. This means that humans normally learn by an order of magnitude more than the most intelligent wild animals and store much more and much more varied information from the outside, the overwhelming part of which is qualitatively different, symbolic in their memory. Much of this learning and memory takes place and is formed in infancy. And then we manipulate this vast amount of information acquired from the outside through, so to speak, education, complete it, construct or create new information through imagination, and store products of our imagination or records of our inner experiences in our memory to manipulate it again and again. A snowball effect is created. Most of the stimuli of the symbolic primary for humans environment are in fact products of the mental process itself. With the emergence of culture and the symbolic environment, in other words, human consciousness or mental life, though not the mental life of every human, becomes self-sustaining, that is independent. Specifically, it becomes independent of learning above a certain minimum. Above a certain minimum, which may be received in childhood, the mind needs very little stimulus from the outside. Indeed, it manipulates and remanipulates, namely augments through imagination information already stored in memory, much of which, to start with, it has created at an earlier point. Memory becomes the major reservoir of stimuli for the continued activity of the nervous system and the brain. In a way, it competes with the environment. For some, it becomes more important than the environment in the individual's efforts to construct the state of equilibrium or comfort. Or perhaps we can say that the cultural environment enters the brain in a major way to start operations there, thus returning to the definition of the mind as culture in the brain, thereby allowing the brains of some, very few, to contribute in major way to the creation of this environment. In addition to making human consciousness self-sufficient, the symbolic cultural human environment necessitates certain other characteristics of the mind. The mind, though a process, can be likened to an individual organism, which exists in a larger structure or process analogous to a species, a culture. Within the mind culture, supported by the imaginative capacities of the animal brain, transformed by the symbolic environment into the specifically human symbolic imagination, necessarily creates three patterned systematic processes which further distinguish the human mind from the mental life of animals. These are compartments of the self or of I, which would also be translated into Russian as lичность, and include first, identity, the relationally constituted self. Second, the agency, will, or acting self. And third, the thinking self, the I of self-consciousness, or what can be called the I of Descartes, because of the pronouncement, I think, therefore I am. In a healthy mind, these three processes are perfectly integrated, serving the needs of the individual and ensuring that he or she is well adjusted to the environment. However, while identity and will are necessary for the individual's adaptation to the cultural environment, and thus for the survival of every individual human, one does not need the I of Descartes to adapt to life within culture. Instead, it is a necessary condition for the culture process on the collective level. What makes possible self-consciousness for any one of us is precisely that which makes possible indirect learning and thus the transmission of human ways of life across generations and distances. This is so because among all the symbolic mental processes, it is the one which is explicitly symbolic, in the sense that it actually operates with formal symbols, the formal media of symbolic expression, particularly language. This is the reason for the dependence of thought on language. Our thought extends only as far as the possibilities of the formal symbolic medium in which it operates. That's why terms of scholarly discussions such as ours must be clearly defined. Confusing language produces confused thought. It is the eye of Descartes that stores all the explicit symbolic information that is the explicit culture in the mind. The essential function of the thinking self being to assure the symbolic process on the collective level, it is enough that only some humans actually use this explicit culture for this process to continue and for culture to be maintained. Because it is unnecessary, it is unlikely that the thinking self and the life of the mind in its specific meaning of the life of thought would be all that common. The uncommon cases of genius, however, are necessarily characterized by such explicit use of culture stored in the mind. Though genius depends on a particularly efficient brain, the definitive characteristic of genius undoubtedly is a characteristic of the mind, not of the brain. It is having the vast resources of a certain sphere of culture at the mind's command, at one's willed recall, that is the complete individualization of the mental process of the eye of Descartes, its perfect integration with the processes of identity and will, and being a component of the self. Otherwise, a very developed, that is educated, cultivated, and active eye of Descartes, often combined with acute intelligence, may lead to madness as well as genius. And if we remember how much more abnormal, that is rare, the condition of genius is from that of madness, is rather more likely to lead.
Thank you so much, dear Professor Greenfeld. I hate interrupting you. I'm so sorry, but we're running out of time.
Yeah, one sentence.
Okay.
This is what happens when the mind becomes sick, when it disintegrates. In this case, the eye of Descartes changes its function from the thinking self or the eye of self-consciousness. It turns into the eye of unwilled self-consciousness. Culture not individualized, observing the mind and experienced as an alien presence within the self. In other words, the higher level of cultivation, education, increases one's chances to become a schizophrenic to a far greater extent than one's chances to leave a mark.
Sure. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for sharing your ideas. Okay, well, this panel is totally serious, academic. Again, you can go a little bit quicker. We've got 10 minutes. We've got wonderful theme to speak about. And right away, let me please give the floor to our next speaker, Rik Pinxten. You're welcome, sir.
Hello, there I am again. I must say I agree with a lot of what the colleague was just saying, but I'd like to add again this one, how shall I say, sort of opening, which comes from comparative studies, so from anthropology, And I'll try to do this. I'm not sure it will work, but I'll try to do this by telling you a few things on my, if you like, my specialism. Now, what is my specialism? I was interested, I'm still interested in how people, human beings in general, would deal with space, spatial notions. How do they orient themselves? How do they eventually measure? How do they conceive of distance, speed, all this sort of things? As you know, space is one of the three, well, so-called universal categories in Kant's philosophy, Immanuel Kant. You have time, you have space, and you have God. Now, whether God is a universal category is very, very, very much to be debated, okay? Time is a very difficult issue still, but what about space? So I set out and discovered that, to begin with, the Chinese, in their tradition, and there's a lot of documentation on that, there's a lot of study on that, of course, they developed not a geometry. No geometry exists in Chinese tradition, but they developed an algebra. Why is that? And why do we in the West think of the citation of Einstein, the geometrization of the world, the geometrization of reality is what physics is all about, okay? This sort of notion. Geometry as the basic formal way of thinking for humanity, let's say, about reality, about nature. The Chinese didn't develop a geometry, yet long before the West, long before Europe, they had hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of irrigation works efficiently, correctly, if you want to call it this way, scientifically correct, okay? They worked with formal ideas, algorithms, etc. They developed the Chinese wall, as you know, which is not, you know, a sort of bric-a-brac. This is really thinking, planning, organizing, etc. Graphic design, everything, but no geometry. Why is this? Well, that's probably linked, and there I come back to what Professor Greenfeld was talking about, probably linked to the fact that classical Chinese, at least, like Mongolian, like these Athabascan languages, I mean, Apache languages, of which Navajo is one, these are what they call verb languages. There are, so to speak, I mean, that's difficult, but well, let's generalize. There are no nouns because the universe is, or reality is, everything that happens, that changes all the time. All these processes, that's the events, if you like. There's very, very, very few, there's a couple of them, but very few. One of them is as Whitehead, philosophers in the West, who would go for a philosophy of events. Most of us go for a philosophy of things, of objects, of timeless things. Okay. Now these cultures probably, like Chinese, etc., probably because of the language, or at least together with the type of language they have, do not reason that way. Okay. Now, if you go and study one of these cultures, like the Navajo culture, for example, that's the one thing, of course, that's extremely striking. There's several like that, but let's stick to this one. So the first thing I did, of course, was present my project of research to a group of school board members, all of them Native Americans, none of them schooled. Absolutely none of them, monolinguals. They only spoke their own language. So with a translator, I introduced what I was trying to study with them, within their culture, within their language. And the reaction of the man who was heading this school board was saying, stop, stop. We acquired curriculum material for our bicultural school. They had a bicultural school in the neighborhood there. And so half Navajo and half American curriculum, let's say. And he said we bought a whole package of curriculum material for mathematics. And this is running us into troubles. It doesn't work. There's something very wrong here. And what you want to study has to do with this. Now that's high academic remark, as far as I understand, from an unschooled, illiterate person who understood, yes, deep down, our minds are cultural and are differently versed, differently oriented, look for different problems and solutions because or linked to the type of language that we have, a verb language versus a noun-verb language, like, for example, English, okay? So he said, if you can help us out with this particular timeless, let's say, object-oriented way of dealing, and this was set theory, really, that is, they started the kids with set theory, which is absurd, I think, but okay, this was a fashion like 30, 40 years ago. If you can help us with this problem that we see and we feel there's something that you're talking about that has to do with this, then you can go ahead and do your research. Now, I tell this story, so it took the rest of my life to try and make this clear, to develop curriculum material for, if you like, a sort of dynamic geometry, which is not a stupid idea because some of our mathematicians very, very recently, like René Thom, like Prigogine, you may know some of these people, they are searching in their highly developed scientific tradition, of course, of natural scientists. They're trying to develop similar ways of how can we sort of dynamize this geometric, timeless, time-independent, if you like, object-centered way of dealing with the world in a very sophisticated way, meaning geometry and other types of mathematics as we know it in the West. How can we dynamize this? And then you speak about catastrophe theory and this sort of thing. And with the Chinese tradition, with the Mongolians, with the, I'm not just saying this, I mean, I had a lot of, over the last 30 years, a lot of discussion about this with people from there, of course, with these groups of Native Americans. This was an issue that was recognized. Yes, indeed, we organize mentally, we organize the world differently. And of course, you can have sophistication there. You can have very learned traditions, if you like. Look at the Chinese wall, that's not nothing. I mean, that's impressive, right? But with a different mathematics, a deeply different, if you try and read, you can do it, algebra, the Chinese algebra, I mean, it's published, there's published material on this. It's intriguing, but you can't, you know, go from there to our algebra, for example. Now, why is this? How can it be so different and yet recognizable and yet, you know, so this diversity, I want to bring in this issue again to say, yes, okay, but do not, let us not restrict ourselves to, you know, education is what we know by that name and by that tradition here locally, and then say, you know, this is happening in all over the world. Yes, but there is diversity that you have to introduce there, and it's a very important one. Now let's not do away with this because we think that we have the knowledge and the other ones have, I don't know, habits or something. Okay, that's my point, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Professor. Thank you for sharing your viewpoints, for delivering your speech. Right away, Adam Glaz. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you. Okay, here comes question 2. So if in question 1, I focused on the development of language in a community, here I'm going to focus a little bit more on the individual, a person, personality and mentality. But as a linguist, I can't exclude language from the equation. So as Rik said, it has to do with perspective. Rather than knowing things, it has to do with a perspective on things. That's my linguistic perspective on how I understand this, this problem. Which means that the question is, for me, is there perhaps any correlation between one's personality, the level of its development, and the language that one speaks? And Rik has just shown us examples of how language influences the human life, basically, not only the way humans think, but the way humans operate. So it is perhaps tempting to assume that there is a direct correlation between personality and the proficiency level of your linguistic performance as an individual speaker. That is, one might assume that the richer your personality, the richer or more varied the language that you use, and vice versa. The better you speak a language, the more developed personality you will have. Now, this is a common sense view that is rather attractive, and in fact, it may just be right in certain respects. But as far as I'm concerned, I have a problem with it, because when you subscribe to this view, you assume that we know both how to measure personality and how to measure the proficiency of language use. As for language, you might say that's easy. It's easy to measure. The person who uses more varied diction or a wider range of grammatical structures, who is a more fluent speaker and so on, is the person whose language is at a higher level of proficiency. And that certainly means that they have a rich personality, does it not? But, there's a but. Take Julius Caesar. He became famous for the straightforwardness and, in a way, simplicity of his style. You know, the famous Gallia est omnis divisa in partes tres. A simple style. And yet he was a leader of notable achievements that can't have been made with an average personality. And I'm leaving aside the moral assessment of these basically military achievements. Or take someone historically closer to us, like Ernest Hemingway, also famous for his style that has been described as simple, unadorned, or direct. If you take the famous last sentence from his The Old Man and the Sea, the old man was dreaming about the lions. It's a very, very simple sentence, very characteristic of his style as a whole. And yet Hemingway was a man of fascinating personality, at least fascinating to some. So maybe it's better to say that the richness of the personalities of Julius Caesar and Ernest Hemingway is correlated with the lucidity of their writing styles. But how would one then classify a writer such as William Faulkner, whose style is the direct opposite? It's immensely elaborate, with long and complex sentences and full of embellishments. I'll just give you one example from the, we all know that, but just one example from the story titled That Evening Sun. I quote, "But 15 years ago on Monday morning, the quiet, dusty, shady streets would be full of Negro women with, balanced on their steady turbaned heads, bundles of clothes tied up in sheets, almost as large as cotton bales, carried so without touch of hand between the kitchen door of the White House and the blackened washpot beside the cabin door in Negro Hollow," unquote. That's one sentence. Now, this is very far from the simplicity of Hemingway's syntax. How is it possible for two American writers, each with a fascinating personality, to produce such vastly different styles? Well, what we see here is that we need to revise our assumption that the richness of one's personality is directly correlated in one-to-one fashion with the richness of one's language. What seems to perhaps be a little bit more convincing is to assume that it's not about richness, but about originality. The originality of one's language can be a mark of their personal development. Well, this view would actually dovetail with how personality is defined in dictionaries. For example, the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines personality as the set of emotional qualities, ways of behaving, etc., that makes a person different from other people. So not more sophisticated, but different. And fair enough. Hemingway and Faulkner can't have been more different in terms of their style. But of course, not everyone is a writer, especially a writer of literature, where you actually work on your style. But everyone is a speaker. Everyone has their own speaking style, which makes each person unique as a speaker, but also as a person. That individual speaking style, called idiolect, is unique to everyone. So we could say that, in fact, there are no languages as we normally understand the term, but only idiolects. Or, to be specific, there is nothing like the English language, but only a few 100 million idiolects, if we take native speakers into account, plus probably something like another billion for whom it's the second language. We have all experienced this. We can recognize a person by the way they speak. Like, okay, she's just used the word divine, and that's so typical of Elizabeth, so it must be her. Or he accents his syllables in a characteristic way, so it must be Tom. Or that speaker begins all her sentences with, well, I mean, so it must be Juliet, and so on. This kind of uniqueness can be manifested in the use of words, grammatical constructions, characteristic idioms or metaphors, but also characteristics of speech, such as intonation, tempo, accent, loudness, and so on. And that is true of everyone, regardless of their age, gender, social background, or level of education. In other words, what we call, for example, the English language is a generalization across all these idiolects, all these unique personalities. Given that, does it make sense to talk about the level of the development of one's personality and mentality and the way it's correlated with language? Perhaps it does. I don't want to say that it does not. But it would be very difficult for me to justify this from the linguistic viewpoint, or to see it as directly correlated with language. Rather, I would be more ready to talk not about the development of personality / mentality, but about personality and mentality as a person's uniqueness. And that indeed has very specific, even measurable linguistic manifestations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Glaz. Could you please conclude your ideas in 30 seconds?
That is all. That is where I stop. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you for delivering your speech. Unfortunately, our next speaker, Dr. Lucien Oulahbib, is experiencing certain technical troubles and issues. So I have to give the floor to our next speaker, Darina Karuna. You're welcome. Please turn on your mic.
I am here. I am here. Oh.
The floor now is given to Darina Karuna already, so we will start if you don't mind, because there were probably some technical difficulties on your side.
Please go on.
Спасибо, что дали слово. Значит, с чего начинается зависимость уровня развития личности и менталитетной составляющей? Она начинается с разочарования в науке.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. So to answer the question, where is the beginning of personality development and the formation of mentality component? The answer is, it all starts with the disappointment in science.
Как это выглядит? Я не знаю, как это выглядит в Европе, как там происходит это в США, но, допустим, у нас это происходит так. Вы отучились 5 лет в университете, приходите на работу, и вам говорят: забудьте все, что вы знали. Мы будем учить вас заново.
I don't know how the disappointment in science takes place in the US and other parts of the world, but in here, it looks as follows. For instance, one person has received his education for decades at the university, And after that, he comes to be employed in a certain organization. And the first thing that he hears, people say to him, you have to forget everything that you were taught at the university. We need the skills.
То есть именно разочарование в науке делит людей на три категории автоматически: на фаталистов, игроков и на учителей.
And this disappointment in science, it roughly divides people automatically into three categories. First one are the players. The first one are fatalists, the players, and teachers.
Это те три качества личности, и это три разных менталитета. По сути своей мы имеем дело с качествами личности, основанные на качестве менталитетной составляющей и ее статусе в иерархии общества.
In other words, this descriptions that I gave, the fatalists, the players, and the teachers, these are qualities of a personality that in turn shape the mentality of a person. So a fatalist would have one type of mentality, a player would have another one. And in turn, there's also three categories define the status of a person in the social hierarchy.
И иерархия выглядит так: вверху учителя, дальше игроки и в самом низу фаталисты.
And the hierarchy in terms of these three categories, types of people, so-called, looks as follows. At the top of the hierarchy, we have the teachers. They are followed by the players, and at the very bottom of the hierarchy, we have fatalists.
И эти вещи изменяемые. То есть фаталист может стать игроком, игрок может стать учителем. К сожалению, лишь только в нашем обществе, в современном, где мы живем, эти изменения имеют очень-очень медленное развитие. И в средние века происходило гораздо быстрее.
It should be pointed out that these categories, these qualities of personality can be changed, certainly. A player might become a teacher, or a fatalist can become a player. The whole problem that in the modern world, this changing process takes very, very slow. It takes a long time. In contrast to Middle Ages, when the changes happened very, very fast.
То есть для того, чтобы понять, что такое фаталисты, мы можем, например, менталитетная составляющая Европы — это, в общем-то, фаталисты в подавляющем своем большинстве, и очень маленькое количество игроков, которые, по сути, и организовывают все общество, безусловно, в своих интересах.
So speaking about, for instance, as an example, modern Europe, then we can say that majority of the people could be classified as fatalists. And only a small portion of the population can be classified as players.
То есть достаточно посмотреть на поведение Европы во время пандемии, и становится все понятно. В общем-то, на эту тему существует целая монография, которую написал академик Мальцев, «Как меня заставили изучать психологию Европы». Она как раз была написана в разгар пандемии, когда экспедиционная группа находилась в Португалии. Португальской научной экспедиции.
And in order, as a demonstration why people in Europe in majority are fatalists, it's enough to look at the behavior of majority during the pandemics because of COVID-19. And there is a lot which is written about the psychology of Europe and all this thing which we see as a reflection in today's world. In the monograph of Dr. Malta, which was written in Portugal last year, when in the epicenter of the pandemic, the title of the monograph is How I Was Made to Study the Psychology of Europe.
И причина склонности к фатализму исходит из бессознательной категории родовая концепция. То есть семейный клан — это то, что делает жизнь человека фатальной.
And the main reason why this type, the fatalism type of mentality occurs, is a certain ancestral heritage. In other words, in simple words, it's a clan, it's a family clan that makes people fatalists.
Существует другая категория – игроки. Здесь данную статусную категорию формируют люди, которые стремятся стать символом своего города. И их философия связана с игрой. И они хотят научиться у тех, кто лучше играет. В общем-то, в каждой игре либо правила существуют, либо они отсутствуют. И здесь вот играют роль навыки. И, в общем-то, люди ищут, у кого лучше всего научиться.
Another type of people that I have mentioned before are players. This certain status category is defined by people who want to learn how to play, how to be successful, how to be victorious in this life. And they are desperately searching for people, for the philosophy, for people that will be able to teach them how to be not defeated in their life.
Ну и есть еще более высокий уровень людей, понятно, с другим менталитетом, это учителя. И вообще, чтобы понять, что происходит, кому очень хочется посмотреть, как это делается, вот есть такой культовый фильм, наверняка все его знают, 1986 года «Спрут», целых 11 сезонов. Вот этот фильм о том, как это делается. То есть Швейцария, Германия, Франция, все задействованы в такой большой политический детектив, где и фаталисты, и игроки, и учителя показаны.
And when speaking about the third level, third type of mentality, the player, I would like to give an example based on the television drama series La Pieuvre. In English, it would be The Octopus. It's a very popular and resonance-making drama which demonstrates actors and personages from different countries all over the Europe. And this drama, this movie actually shows all three types of people, all three types of mentalities in one: fatalists, the players, and the teachers.
То есть, как мы видим вот эту иерархию, когда мы на нее смотрим, мы понимаем, что у каждой степени этой иерархии своя менталитетная составляющая, а качество личности определяют менталитетную составляющую. То есть не наоборот, не менталитетная составляющая определяет качество личности, а качество определяют менталитетную составляющую. И это еще одно научное открытие академика Мальцева.
And when we look at this hierarchy, we understand that every level of the hierarchy has its own mentality component. And what is significant and very important is that the qualities of a personality, they define what type of mentality component he has. It's not vice versa. It's not like mentality defines the quality of personality. It's quality of personality defining mentality. And this is one of the scientific findings of academician Dr. Rik Pinxten.
То есть человек вынужден искусственно менять менталитет, чтобы мочь называться каким-то статусом. И что самое важное, что сначала в человеке происходят изменения, а потом изменяется его менталитетная составляющая.
The point is that every human being has no choice but to artificially adjust, change his mentality component in order to receive or in order to be called a different status. So what is paramount is that first, a person himself has to change in a certain way. And only after that, his mentality component will start changing.
То есть у нас появляется некая формула зависимости от статуса менталитет. Вот как зависит уровень развития личности от менталитетной составляющей. Спасибо за внимание.
So in other words, we have a certain dependency. We have the status and the mentality, and they're interdependent. And this is my answer to the second question, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for sharing your viewpoints, for delivering your speeches. And by this, let me thank all the speakers, colleagues, experts, and overall, this is the high time we have finished the third online panel of our International Interdisciplinary Conference, The Role of Mentality in Human Life and Culture, arranged by the European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Once again, I'm respecting and I'm pleased to thank our dear speakers, Liah Greenfeld, Rik Pinxten, Glaz, Lucien Oulahbib, as well as Darina Karuna. For our speakers and listeners, I should say that soon after the conference issues, the text papers, video reports, online discussion results, they will be published on the conference website later on. Furthermore, a conference resolution will be published as well, available to those who are interested. And by this, thank you so much for your kind attention. Thank you for your participation, and see you soon. See you tomorrow. Be safe. Good luck and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.